like that. Move that over. Okay. There we go. Let me make sure that this is good for these guys at home. All right. Yeah, so chemical evolution is this process of where, molecules keep getting more and more complicated. And this chemical evolution of concentrating and building up chemicals led to a process called abiogenesis. And of course, bio means life, a means without, and genesis means origin of. So abiogenesis is the origin of life from something that's non-living. And basically, this chemical evolution went from geochemistry, and eventually we got biochemistry. Okay, that's origins of life right there. So at some point, we've got this chemical evolution. We are going from simple molecules to more complex molecules. And when it comes to abiogenesis, that chemical evolution is what we're really doing is making organic molecules. So basically, to make an organic molecule, you're adding, at its most simplest level, hydrogens to carbons. That's about as simple as we can get, right? Is adding hydrogen to carbon, because carbon dioxide, this is not an organic molecule, even though it's got carbon, but the minute you add hydrogen to it, you have what we consider an organic molecule. Okay, so now we have multiple theories regarding origins of life. And before we start discussing anything, let's just come right out and say it about how life got started on the planet. We don't know. There's a lot we don't know. And a lot of it is speculation, but a lot of it is also experimentally driven, and a lot of it is observationally driven. And what I mean by observationally driven is looking at where we see life today, making comparisons to all of that life. Experimentally driven as things we've actually done in the lab, looking at ways we may have had abiogenesis. Now, abiogenesis, how life arose on this planet or anywhere in the universe, like I said, there's just so much we don't know. And one of the ways I feel, now this is, I'm a little bit different from the book here, but I'm not the only one, because I didn't form my opinions from the book. I formed my opinions from reading other authors who studied this. Like, I didn't just come up with this. This came from Russell, Mike Russell, and Nick Lane, and others that study these problems. So I'm in line with those guys. But one of the ways to think about abiogenesis is to think about what life does. This question of what is life? And the book sets up a set of characteristics of life, right? Life reproduces, life evolves, life uses energy, life has metabolism. And as biologists, in all honesty, we tend to think of life as these characteristics. We tend to really focus on reproduction and evolution, because evolution, of course, is the central paradigm to biology. And evolution is made possible because we reproduce. And reproduction ensures the continuity of life, right? Think about this. You represent an unbroken lineage going back nearly 4 billion years. An unbroken lineage. Your great, insert, I don't know how many billions ancestors were a population of bacteria living in a hot vent in an ancient ocean. That's astounding. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that often the way that we define life or view life can affect the way we think abiogenesis happens. So if you're focused on reproduction evolution, as biologists correctly would be, then you're going to look for theories that support reproduction first, right? Got to start reproducing. If you're a geologist or a geochemist, or somebody who studies biochemistry, you might think of life a little bit differently. You might think of life as my geologist friend once told me over a few beers. He goes, Tom, the reality is biology is just an extension of geology. Because you're just an extension of geological cycles. And I was like, what? Drink a couple beers. I need another beer on that one. And then I finally realized he was absolutely right. There's a carbon cycle. Carbon is in the atmosphere, it's carbon dioxide. It's fixed by a plant into carbohydrates. All the carbon in your body, every single carbon atom that's used was carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, fixed by a plant in photosynthesis, eaten by you, and then we excrete carbon species, we excrete carbon, the carbon dioxide we breathe. That carbon dioxide can be picked up by another plant outside and then sequestered in the plant for a few years. That you could have carbon dioxide that you excrete get put into the ocean, form calcium carbonate, and enters the rock cycle. We have rocks that are weathering, releasing CO2. Volcanoes are releasing CO2. So the point that I'm saying is that just even the carbon inside your body is going back and forth between biological reservoirs, which is it's residing in something living. It could be in rocks, it could be in the atmosphere, and the carbon is constantly moving back and forth between that, right? So that's how we're part of geological cycles. And in fact, all the elements in your body move around between being in a life form and back into like either rocks or the atmosphere. Pretty wild, isn't it? So now, that's another way. So as a biologist, we're thinking about life as reproducing and evolving. So we're going to look for abiogenesis that would emphasize reproduction and evolution. If you're a geologist who studies, the ancient Earth, you might say, hey, life is an extension of geological cycles, right? And then if you're a biochemist or a physicist, you might say, life is a system out of equilibrium with this environment, right? Life uses energy to create order and maintain homeostasis through metabolism. So we have these complex chemical reactions. Life emerges from these complex chemical reactions. Life is an emergent property. So you start to see the story I'm trying to paint a little bit, like the way we view life affects the way we might study the origins of life. If you're in NASA, NASA defines life very differently than the book. I really like NASA's definition too. Anybody know what it is by any chance? You got a computer? Look it up. I think, yeah, if you guys got computers out, you can look it up.
It says life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution.
Yeah, I had to ask, man. Sorry, you're wearing a NASA shirt, so I had to ask you with a computer in front of you. I'm like, you got to look that up for us. Yeah, a self-sustaining chemical reaction capable of Darwinian evolution. Wow, does that really take whatever chemistry there is and say it doesn't matter what type of chemistry? It calls it a self-sustaining chemical chemistry that's capable of evolving. Wow, that's really broad, isn't it? Is that anything like the one in the book? No, it's not. And I've challenged you guys to think about life as an action, as a verb. Life does something. And chemical reactions is doing something, right? Evolving is doing something. Life uses energy to create order. Okay, so, wow. What do you guys think now? So when you read the book about this thing called the Rna World Hypothesis, or sometimes it's called the Rna World Theory. I'm not so sure it should be called a theory yet. I don't think it has the support it should have. But did you guys look this up at all? Yeah, what'd you guys find? Okay, let me direct it more. Let me ask a more direct question. How many of you found papers or articles in support of the Rna World Hypothesis? Did you find any in support of it? Yes, yeah, definitely. Did you find a lot that were not in support of it? Yeah. Now, does the book talk like this is the way it happened? did the book read as if the RNA World Hypothesis is exactly how life arose on this planet? I'm smiling underneath my mask. You can't see it, but I'm grinning from ear to ear because I'm trying to make a point. But when you read the chapter, how many of you read the chapter? All right, a few of you did. Good, good, good. So, if I were in biology, I would have skipped over a bit of it and almost immediately read the one on origins of life, the last section. But yeah, so when you read the book, to me, it really sounded like the RNA World Hypothesis is the way life arose on this planet. And my point is, I think the book spoke a little bit too much of the affirmation, like this is the way it happened, versus thinking about its one hypothesis. So yeah, did you guys get the same sense? All right, yeah, I'm trying to get you guys to kind of think out of the box a little bit. The book's not necessarily wrong either, but it might not be right. And I think it presented the RNA World Hypothesis as though that's how it happened. And if we start reading our textbooks and just accepting it as that's the way it is, and not asking questions based on some general principles that we're already learning, then things become dogmatic very quickly. And the authors of the book clearly don't really study abiogenesis. It's quite clear that they do not. So let's talk some more about abiogenesis. We've got some early experimentations, and I've already talked about one. Do you remember the experiment that took place in the 1950s looking at chemical evolution? You remember the name of it? Used a flask, some light, some little sparks, some water. The Miller experiments. It's also called the Miller-Urey experiments because Stanley Miller was a postdoc in Harold Urey's lab. And Urey was actually a Nobel Prize winning scientist. It was the Miller experiment was the first experiment to really test chemical evolution, right? And chemical evolution is, at its heart, we're building up more complex molecules, right? We're building up organic molecules by basically adding hydrogen to carbon. And now, of course, life is way more complicated than that, but we got to start with the basics. The Miller experiment, I believe, was around 1952. And do you remember what they showed? What did we learn from this experiment? Well, okay, let me ask you this question. In the experiment, they took a flask, and this is why I love PowerPoint. And then they had a little chamber over here that they sparked this with. Then they had a little catchment tube down here. Oh, let's connect it here. And so basically there was a little flame here. Yeah, as you can tell, I'm a great artist. But here's our flask. And inside here, they added in things like nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water. I think they had some hydrogen gas in there. I can't remember if they had ammonia or not. We could just ammonia, methane. I don't remember the exact molecules. That what they put in there exactly is not. It is important, but not for our purposes. And they put these molecules in there because they had just recently been able to look at the atmosphere of Jupiter. And they said, the atmosphere of Jupiter is unaffected by life. It might represent what the early atmosphere of Earth looked like before life. Because our atmosphere is almost a complete product of life, right? 22% oxygen would almost certainly never, ever, ever occur without something putting it there. And what puts our oxygen out there, right? Plants, photosynthesis. So at any rate, these simple molecules here, they put them in this flask, they heated it up, they shocked it with some electricity. This, of course, you need energy to break bonds, right? It takes energy to break a bond. Boiling the water is not enough energy, so you zap it with some electricity, you break the bonds, and you get new bonds, you get new chemicals. And over a period of a few weeks, this water went from clear the pinkish, the brownish, and it formed, well, do you remember what it formed? Amino acids. We've talked about this, right? Building blocks of proteins, right? We got some simple sugars. We got pyruvate, right? I forget if acetaldehyde or acetic acid, the 2-carbon sugar or 2-carbon compound. And the point is that it showed that you could get simple organic molecules easily, including the building blocks of our macromolecules like proteins, carbohydrates, lipids even, which are, and nucleic acids. That's pretty wild, isn't it? In addition to the Miller-Urey experiment, well, before I move on, so they came up with the prebiotic soup theory. And of course, this was coined in the 1920s by J.B.S. Haldane, and I actually forgot the other guy that came up with it independently. But this idea of the prebiotic soup theory was that in the early oceans, there were all of these organic molecules floating around, and somehow life arose out of that prebiotic soup. Of course, there's a real problem with that, right? What we learned, organic chemistry, making the building blocks of life is easy, isn't it? And in fact, what's really, really cool is that whenever we look at like meteors that land on the Earth, they have amino acids in them. The amino acids are made in outer space. We can detect them on meteors that land, and we know that they're made in outer space because they have equal mixtures of left-handed and right-handed amino acids, and we know that life has chirality. All the amino acids made by life on this planet are all left-handed, and all the sugars are right-handed. Right, so chirality is a function of life. So we know that those amino acids were actually made in outer space. It's really cool. There's also things like pyrimidines made in outer space. Ring structures. One of the most common organic molecules in outer space are pyrimidines. Wow, astounding, right? So the prebiotic soup theory, Miller, he went to his grave basically defending this theory as the origins of life. So it had a really big benefit, right? It showed us that these organic molecules are easily made, but what's a drawback of the prebiotic soup theory for abiogenesis? Yeah.
They don't know how it transitioned from those amino acids and whatnot to living beings.
Absolutely. How do you take a prebiotic soup and transition that, I love the word transition, by the way, to something living? How do you take a flask with a whole bunch of building blocks and get a living cell out of that? Yeah, it's hard, right? But because if you start thinking about, life as a system that replicates, you're like, somehow you got to get a self-replicating molecule coming out of this. If you think of life as a system out of equilibrium with this environment, that's using energy to create order, now we can start thinking of things differently. If we think of life as an extension of geological processes, right, then we might start thinking things a little bit differently. So in this case, the prebiotic soup, you guys get this, I think, very well. It showed us that organic molecules, the building blocks of life, are easy to make. They'd be abundant, but because there's no way to get this system out of equilibrium in here, you're not going to have life emerge. It no way explains how life could have emerged. Now, the next theory I think they call it a theory. Just based on the definitions of theories, it's debatable if it's a theory or a hypothesis. Theories are just really well supported. And Rna World Hypothesis was actually thought of as early as the 1960s. I think Crick actually thought about it in the 1960s. And then it was formalized in the 1980s, and I think the guy's name was Walter Gilbert. I think that was right. And if anybody's on your computer, feel free to look it up if you want and chime in. So the RNA world hypothesis really took place in the 1980s. And as the book is showing that we learned about RNA, RNA is a really cool molecule. RNA stores information. RNA can catalyze its own reactions or catalyze chemical reactions. And in fact, 30 Nobel Prizes have been awarded, right? 30 scientists have won a Nobel Prize studying the functionality of RNA inside of our cells. RNA is just like so incredibly important to the functioning of our cells because it regulates almost all the activities of our cells. It's amazing, right? So in the RNA world hypothesis, they realized in the 1980s that RNA can store information and it can catalyze reactions. And the idea is that RNA can become a self-replicating molecule. And if you are replicating, biologists love this, right? Because biology is, wow, if I can reproduce, I can evolve. Reproduction, evolution, right? I mean, evolution is a natural consequence of being able to reproduce because you can't reproduce perfectly. So this theory, these RNA world hypothesis, just took off. I mean, it's in your textbook, right? I mean, they talk about the textbook is like, this is how it happened. What do you guys think about it? Kind of early in the morning to think about abiogenesis and our RNA world hypotheses, right? Yeah.
We're not quite there yet.
I agree with that. We're not quite there yet. So everybody jumped on this RNA world hypothesis very quickly because biologists focus a lot on reproduction and evolution. So here is this molecule that could reproduce, it could reproduce itself, right, and carry out chemical reactions. And even the book said they called it a living molecule. Dude, you can't have a living molecule. I'm sorry, right? That goes against, that's not even what we're even talking about in terms of life. So I hate the fact they called it a living molecule. So we get this RNA world hypothesis, and it's like I said, it became almost it's ubiquitous everywhere. Can you think of any problems with the RNA world hypothesis?
RNA is unstable.
RNA is unstable, right? Also, it doesn't get very long. And in fact, if anybody came across this when I said look at it, I think that the longest RNA molecule that is capable of sustaining itself is about 50 nucleotides long. I think it's called, I think the term was somebody coined it Spiegelman's monster, because every time they ran these simulations in the lab, RNA would always get to be about 50 nucleotides long, and that was about it. Is that long enough for a life? No way. I mean, the most simplest of bacteria have 3 million base pairs, right? Even simple viruses have, several genes they have to code for, and most genes are longer than 50 base pairs. I mean, at best, that would only code for less than 20 amino acids. About 17. That's a pretty short polypeptide. Most of your proteins are hundreds of amino acids long. So RNA world hypothesis has these real problems. One, just from a biochemical point of view, it's unstable. It's sticky, which means it forms a lot of hydrogen bonds. And in fact, when we have RNA, we have to have things tear things away from it because it likes to stick to stuff. It's a very complex molecule to belong to just arisen in a prebiotic soup. There's another problem with it. So like I said, and in fact, if you Google problems with RNA world, there's people out there saying the theory is dead. I'm not going to say it's dead yet, and I'm going to come back to this for just a second. Another popular theory is called metabolism first theory. Metabolism first posits that you had organic evolution where you started these chemical reactions, and then after you get the chemical reactions going, that RNA and DNA replication and all this directed activity came second to metabolism. Metabolism first came out of geochemistry. The chemical evolution is a process of geochemistry. And the geochemists and biochemists are going, you know, if life is a system out of equilibrium that uses energy, they ask a question. We talk about what does life do. The next thing is, well, what does every living organism share in common? And it's very easy to say we use energy and ATP, but surprisingly, whenever I teach the second half of this class, there's a process that you will learn with Dr. Adama called chemiosmosis. Chemiosmosis is where you use you use a proton gradient, use hydrogen ions moving through a large protein complex called ATP synthase to make your majority of ATP. It's called chemiosmosis. Osmosis means to push. So you have a membrane inside your mitochondria. You have this large protein here called ATP synthase. The protons flow through there, and it uses that energy of these protons moving to generate ATP, called chemiosmosis. It's probably the secret to life. In fact, I wrote it in my book that I wrote. I talk about it being the secret to life. It's called The Amazing Journey of Life, The Amazing Story of Life. And every single cell on this planet uses proton gradients. What I mean by that is I've got more protons, which is just a hydrogen ion, on one side of a membrane than another to generate ATP. Wow, every single cell makes ATP this way. Yeah.
So would it have been like the electron transport chain first to create the gradient? Or ATP synthase first?
That is a fantastic and very insightful question, and they probably came second. Here's where we start using geochemistry. Here's where we start thinking of systems out of equilibrium to understand origins of life and how this probably was, to say in Arkansas, North Florida style, intertwangled with each other, intertangled. Let me explain further. If you're a geologist and you're studying the origins of life, you're going to say, you know, we're an extension of geological systems. And if you realize life is a system out of equilibrium, if you're out of equilibrium with your environment, you can actually use that disequilibrium to do work. If all life requires energy, and every living system on this planet uses this process of chemiosmosis to make ATP, to make energy. If we start looking for the places on the ancient Earth where you might find that, where would you find a proton gradient? That's our proton gradient, isn't it? A change in pH across a surface. And the question is, okay, where could we find that? And the answer, it turns out, is likely in this thing called an alkaline vent. And if anybody is interested in Googling it, I had a picture of it. It's called the Lost City of Atlantis, or just a lost city. And whenever you Google it, if you're not on my computer, make sure you type in alkaline vent, or you'll get all kinds of weird stuff. I almost had a chance to go here. I got to go down in the submarine in my graduate studies, down to the bottom of the Gulf. And the guy that was on the project said, hey, we need you to go out to the Atlantic. Can you go? And I couldn't get out of my TA responsibilities. And they said, yeah, we just got this newly discovered vent out there we're going to go to. Turns out it was an alkaline vent. At least I got to go down once. I actually went down twice. Okay, Alkaline vents. What's the pH? High or low? Above 7 or below 7? Above 7. Okay. Let's go back to the Hadean Earth. You probably don't know your geological times, and that's okay. But let's go back 4 billion years ago. And from all the evidence that we can get, the oceans were acidic compared to today. And a lot of that had to do with the enormous amounts of carbon dioxide that were in the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide, of course, was dissolving into the ocean and forming carbonic acid. So the ancient oceans were much more acidic than they are today. And these alkaline vents have a pH of 8, 9. I don't think they get much more alkaline than 9, maybe 10. But the point is there's over a 1,000-fold difference in the number of protons in the oceans than inside these alkaline vents. Wow. There's a proton gradient. What does all life use to make energy or to make ATP? Proton gradient. And it turns out I had this beautiful picture of the lost city of Atlantis, but you guys can look that up later. And what happens is, there are these geological formations that the hot water, so we got these oceans, right? The oceans, the water gets down into the ground. The world is really hot. We got a lot of magma. The water interacts with the rock and the heat. And what it does is it releases things like hydrogen gas. It releases carbon dioxide. That's why we have CO2 coming out of our volcanoes, some hydrogen gas. And it also has all these minerals that come out of there that are reduced. Reduced means you can gain an electron from it. You guys know redox reactions?
Yeah.
Good. So these things are reduced, which means you can gain an electron for energy from it. So the minerals that come out would be like pyrite, iron sulfides, magnesiums, and nickels, and all of these different metals. What happens is you've got these geological features. This warm, mineral-rich water is moving through it. And inside of here are all these little chambers, tiny little chambers that the water is moving through. And these chambers would get lined with metals, like iron. And what those little metals would do is they form their catalyst. Metal ions help chemical reactions occur. So while there's hydrogen gas and carbon dioxide, mixing, this is one of the few things that can react with carbon dioxide and actually release some energy. Hydrogen is a really, get your lunch and get it for free too, right? But you can put hydrogen gas next to carbon dioxide, nothing will ever happen. So if I've got like a metal ion, those ions can actually help these two mix together and form, lo and behold, an organic molecule. Wow. So inside of these alkaline vents, you got these tiny little chemical reactors. So you get all this stuff moving up through them. They're being lined with metal ions that could facilitate these chemical reactions. And we have this generation of more and more complex organic molecules. And because you're inside of these little chemical generators, chemical reactors, every time you make a new organic molecule, it doesn't just diffuse away into the ocean like you would in the prebiotic soup. It actually concentrates these things. And this is the idea of the metabolism first theory of life, or hypothesis. That the metabolism came first, making and breaking bonds, chemical reactions, building things up, breaking things down. This right now is very popular. It still has its problems. Rna World is still very popular, has its problems as well. But the idea is how we look at life. If we don't think of it as a system out of equilibrium, we might think that this is okay. But that will never explain how life got started. If you focus on reproduction, evolution, you might buy wholly into this. I did for a decade. I was like, Rna World, this is cool. And it took people explaining to me or getting me to think of life a little bit differently. And now I'm like, oh man, we need to look for areas where something is out of equilibrium with the environment. So in these little chemical reactors, hydrogen gas, carbon dioxide, moving through here, bringing energy, the insides aligned with metals to facilitate these chemical reactions. But we've also got this out of equilibrium because the surrounding oceans would have been acidic, the inside would have been alkaline, which would have given it a flow of electrons in, protons in, and eventually, somehow, we got an ATP synthase way long after that. But we think that that's how life got started there. Yeah.
To me, the RNA world theory or hypothesis jumps the gun a little bit.
Which one does?
The RNA world
Mm-hmm.
jumps the gun a little bit for me. It seems like it's like that's very complex system established. I don't like there's a lot of pieces that were missing for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll actually, when I get out of later this afternoon, I'll go ahead, I'll post a couple papers for you guys to read that are on this. Russell and Martin, two of my favorite authors on origins of life. I didn't make this up. I got this from these guys. This is what I'm kind of giving a synopsis of what they've done in their labs. And from my own life experiences of thinking about origins of life, I've really become interested in it in the last 15 years. And it's something I've really enjoyed reading on. And at any rate, but you're absolutely right. This one jumps the gun, and this one also has problems too. So as we're talking about origin of life, and the first thing I said was, man, we just don't know. We may never know. But that's okay. You don't stop looking. You don't stop trying. As we get more sensitive tools out, we can reconstruct more of the Earth's past. We can get more details of what it was like. We can start to recreate those areas where we think life may have gotten started. And like I said, thinking about how we think about life will also help us determine origins of life as well. So let's go on really quick and talk about a couple of the problems with both of these. Abiogenesis is likely this really complex thing. And I doubt any one theory will ever explain it. We may never know. We might find out next year. It's interesting, somebody might actually reproduce life in a lab in 5 years from now, and we did it. We could go 1,000 years and never reconstruct it. But you don't stop. That's the beauty of science. You keep trying. The Rna World Hypothesis probably was important inside those reaction chambers. I think I agree with Russell and Martin and Nick Lane that life almost certainly got started in these alkaline vents or some geological feature. I don't think it got started adhering to clay particles or in a pond somewhere. I think it was deep in the ocean in a hydrothermal vent somewhere, because that satisfies a system out of equilibrium. It allows for chemical evolution, and it allows for, and it explains this one simple thing that's ubiquitous to all life, just straight up. Without energy, there's no life. How does all life make ATP? Chemical osmosis, using a proton gradient. There's your natural proton gradient right there. So this is probably right. So the idea of this being the only answer, or this being the only answer, is probably not the case. Almost certainly what's happening is we are in some type of geothermal vent, like there's an extension of geological processes, right? This system is out of equilibrium with this environment. But then, it's probably at some point, RNA metabolism started working, RNA started working with proteins very early on, and they probably co-evolved together. It was unlikely RNA came first and was replicating, and that led to life. It was also just as unlikely that you had all these advanced chemical reactions making things, breaking them down without any involvement of RNA and DNA. And in fact, just last year, or in 2020, a paper came out that said that this early metabolism first in RNA world, that they could actually make DNA just as easy as RNA and stick it together, the two just as easy. It's always been thought that RNA came first because DNA is like an evolved RNA, persistence in the hydroxyl group, is using uracil. And what these people discovered was it didn't have to be that way. RNA did not necessarily have to come first. which is something we've been believing for nearly 30 years. And that paper just came out like in 2020. Pretty wild stuff, isn't it? Okay, any questions or comments? Did I lose anybody, or everybody kind of on this? I kind of repeated myself several times there. Yeah.
It's kind of a weird question, but it would be, how would these change for like silicon-based life, like for extra solar life, like the differences maybe between them?
Yeah, you know, that's a really, really good question. And that's why I like the NASA definition of life, looking for these self-sustaining chemical reactions that's capable of Darwinian evolution. You know, people have speculated about silicon-based life for a long time. And if you guys remember, we do not have a periodic chart in here. Oh, there it is. If you look up here, you'll see that carbon, there's boron carbon, and then right below it is silicon. And what makes carbon the element of life, as you remember, and this is a really good just reminder before the test next week, is that carbon can form up to 4 covalent bonds, including with carbon, so you can get all these very complex molecules. Well, silicon also has 4 valence electrons capable of forming 4 covalent bonds. So people thought about silicon-based life outward somewhere else. This will almost certainly never happen. For one, what happens with silicon is where you've got carbon has 2 electron shells, silicon has, these are out here in this 3rd electron shell. And as a result of these electrons being further away, they're more energetic than they are here. Energetic means they tend to be less stable. So if I start going silicon, silicon, silicon through covalent bonds like this, that becomes pretty unstable. Carbon does it fairly easily. The silicon, those bonds are very unstable. And then we see lots of silicon on the Earth. You guys know it is silicon dioxide, which is beach sand, quartz, and glass. It reacts with oxygen. Oxygen being very electronegative holds onto those electrons very strongly, and as a result, it's hard to do much with silicon dioxide. It's hard to use silicon as a molecule that's as an element that's versatile enough to form large complex organic molecules. And plus, could you imagine if you were oxidizing silicon with oxygen, you'd create sand, and you'd have to excrete a solid out of your body. That would make it very hard. And like I said, we have lots of silicates, lots of silicon in the Earth's crust. It's all in rock. Although artificial life would be silicon-based, right? That's a Star Trek episode, just saying. The Star Trek The Motion Picture. There you go. Yeah, so I would doubt very seriously that silicon would be used for life, except for maybe like artificial life. However, there's another episode in The Next Generation where they formed these naturally occurring computer chips in the sand, and there was saltwater aquifer, salt water in the sand. So that allowed for the movement of electrons and signals between these, things. It was a NASA definition of life, but using silicon. It was really brilliant. It was one of the brilliant episodes of Star Trek. 1/3 of them should never be watched. 1/3 are brilliant. Yeah.
I was gonna say you essentially have to force them to be stable. That doesn't always work out so well. Francium, for example.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, and I don't know enough about biochemistry and PChem. It's been 30 years or 24 years or 28 years since I've had PChem. But I forget my energetics. Like if you cooled that down to like, let's say you were in Titan or something and you were in liquid methane, how stable that bond would be. And that's something that I haven't thought about actually. Good question though, yeah. Silicon-based life.
Bose-Einstein condensates.
Yep. Anybody else have any other comments or questions? Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the abiogenesis part of this. To me, it's a lot of fun to talk about this kind of stuff and think about origins of life. And I don't mean to be down on the book. I think the book is not wrong. I think they just presented it a little too, this is how it happened. It's like, not so fast, hold on, there's a lot more out there. And one of the reasons why I wanted you guys to think about that is not just to go question every textbook you ever read. I mean, they're great tombs of knowledge, right? Tombs. Sorry about that. They're great references, and they have lots of information, and they rarely have mistakes, right? They're really good references. But it's good to like not just accept everything we read in the textbook as that's the way it is, and to like challenge those things sometimes, because when we challenge them, that's when we make new discoveries. And thinking about things differently than what you might have read in one place, thinking about things differently can lead to new insights. Like thinking about life as a system out of equilibrium leads to new insights about abiogenesis. Or thinking about life as like we're just an extension of geological processes. Okay. Well, you know, I'm going to start carbohydrates next week. I'm not going to start it today. I mean, I could, but I figured we could have a little bit of a break here. Carbohydrates I'll get through on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Normally I would start carbohydrates today, but since the test is online next week, I don't have to use a day of lecture. I mean, to get the test. I have an extra day to lecture, an extra day to interact with you and talk to you guys about stuff, which I think is fantastic. So we'll do carbs next week. Carbs are really fun. Once again, I'll start out why they're important, because they're really cool. They're more than just a source of energy, which the book chapter ended like, next life needed a source of energy. They needed a membrane. Just saying. So when we talk about membranes after test 1, that'll be fun too. All right, I'll see you guys next week. And yeah, your homework should be posted. Yeah, there was a mistake on it. I think I fixed it. So if you saw your grade get fixed. Yeah.
Freudian slip there with the tubes of knowledge.
Well, that wouldn't be Freud, but yeah. What's that?